Well, hello and welcome back to Read Becca. It's time once again for my weekly chatty catch up on everything I read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading, as well as some general lifey chit chat and catch up. This week was a little hectic for me, so I did not read very much, but we also have some catch up to do. My brain is discombobulated, so we'll see if I even get through this today or if I have to abandon ship. So first off, the catch up is because multiple weeks ago, I mentioned I was reading The Princess Bride for my book club, and I sort of forgot to loop back around after finishing it for book club and having the book club meeting to talk about it. So it's been multiple weeks and I have forgotten to talk about it. So let's wrap it up here. So The Princess Bride is associated with the movie of the same name, but it is not exactly the same thing, mainly in the framing narrative. So the framing is present outside of the actual story, but the actual book is the same story for the most part. The major beats. The framing narrative here, though, is much more meta and about writing and publishing. So we're sort of hearing from this adult guy who is looking back on his childhood and this experience of encountering this story and really enjoying it and wanting to abridge it into just the good parts, basically, removing the sort of kissing parts. So you can see the influence and how, where the movie came from. But it is quite different. In the actual story that we're reading, the story of Wesley and Buttercup, that is an adventure story with some hints of romance, it feels very fragmentary in the book. It feels like you're jumping scenes, and that's as a result of this supposed abridgment. We, outside of that in the real world, know, obviously, this is not actually an abridged book. It was written this way. And that meta commentary, for me, what I read into it is that this is sort of commentary on romance novels, on the way that guys perceive romance novels, because they keep talking about how this is this has sort of this fluff in there that got taken out that he didn't enjoy. But there is so much there still that is great, and the action and adventure, the characterization is still very, very strong. And I was really surprised by that aspect, because we are sort of jumping from scene to scene. How well developed and fleshed out the characters are really rings true to what the strength of the story is. And that's something I found as I developed as a romance reader only within the past 10 years. I was very anti-romance before that, probably. But character development in romances is such a big aspect. So I sort of read into things to make that assessment. I didn't specifically see any kind of literary criticism that says this was a take on romance novels, but you can get that sense based on the things that are skipped over, based on the chapter titles. So the chapter titles tell you that there's a lot more going on than what you're actually seeing on the page. But the main plot beats here are the action adventure that a little boy would really love, and you can see why he loved it, why he got so swept up in it. And yet it is still kind of a nice love story. The characters, I think, are a little bit more abrasive in the book versus the movie, especially Buttercup. She's definitely dumber in the book, and Wesley maybe is a little too good for her, really, but the heart wants what it wants, right? It was also interesting to see the places where the movie really developed out things that aren't really there in the book, like the fire swamp aspect. That whole journey is not there, and the ROUSs are not a big part of this story. Even though that's what everybody grasps onto from the film. So I have so much nostalgia for the film. It was really hard to extricate my experience of the book from the film. And so I can't assess what this would be like for somebody coming into the story blind, not having an experience with the film. And I'm sorry, because most of my talking has been on the assumption that you are familiar with this story. But it is really fun, entertaining. It's full of action and adventure, great characters. One of the things that stood out for me as a big surprise, I think, was that this is supposed to be the real world. This is supposed to be Earth. And we know one of the characters is a Spaniard. I always knew that, but I hadn't put together that Spain was part of the real world. And all of these places that they are going are sort of these fictional countries meant to have existed in the past, sort of theoretically. So it's not a fantasy land, even though it's sort of a fantasy version of reality. And that was interesting to me. I hadn't really thought about it before. So I think that there was so much there to enjoy and to pull out of it that I had such a great time, and it was a great discussion for book club. This was, I think, one of the most consistent across the board. Everybody seems to enjoy it very, very highly. So Great book, great book club read, super fun. I'm so glad I finally got to this sort of modern classic, I guess it would fit into. Really, really good. And then the other thing that I read, that I finished, has been ongoing for a very, 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 very long time. And I'm both happy and sad to be finishing it up. It feels like there are a lot of endings going on right now. So I finished up the complete Edgar Allan Poe, obviously by Edgar Allan Poe. What a journey! And I'm not going to hold this up for the whole time because it is massive. I think this is over 800 pages in this edition, and it's really tiny text. So I was doing a very long-term buddy read, I think almost 2 years, maybe, something like that, with my wonderful friend Shannon, who is no longer on BookTube actively, but formerly of That's So Poe. So obviously she was the perfect person to be reading this with, because she has some experience reading Poe before, and I think we had a similar approach to it where we weren't taking it overly seriously, but we were also sort of looking at information and background about the things that we were reading and going through it slowly enough that we were able to do that. So it was such an enriching experience to read the stories. So I think I probably am going to talk more about the experience than the actual stories or anything specific about Poe's writing. What was so intriguing is that the approach we took, we have different editions, and so we sort of followed chronologically, first through all of the poems and then through all of the tales, using the Wikipedia bibliography of his works, so that we had a shared source to follow. And what worked so well about that, I think especially for the poems, is that we really got to see the growth of him as a writer and the different themes that he carried through his writing over time, really strongly. We also got to see things from his real life impact his writing as we were going, because we were looking into that background of, what was going on. Poe was such an interesting figure because he, and you see this in his writing, the wide variety of types of writing he did. He was both very melancholic and brooding, and also really funny and humorous and flirtatious. Poe was a massive flirt. So there were a lot of love poems that he was writing for ladies that he was interested in and things like that, but also really brooding death poems. And that comes so much out of his real life where he was a big flirt. He was constantly amorous and out flirting with the ladies, but also he had all of these deaths in his life. He lost many women who were really important to him, including his mother, who affected him very, very much. And so you get to see that whole picture of him as an individual. And the humor side did not work always for either of us, I think, along the buddy read, but it was curious to see that side of him and see that he was a multi-layered person, and not just dark and emo all the time. So that lent toward satire, mostly, I would say. I think the satires where, there were a lot of things of him because he was a writer and he was also working in publishing. He very often makes fun of aspects of that, of the writing process, or of newspapers. And clearly they're targeted toward specific people or companies that he worked for, papers he worked for. So there are really niche things that of the time that he is skewering in his satires that just aren't going to hit the same now. But some of the humor really worked for me, and specifically I think his sci-fi and his sci-fi with humor really worked for me because it was just so silly. And I liked those more silly aspects than the satirical aspects. So things like the balloon hoax certainly was a really great one, where he's actively making this story of a balloon, which was sort of new technology at the time, going to the moon. And the whole point of the story is that the whole thing is a hoax that this guy is perpetrating, a very elaborate hoax, in order to get out of debt that he has. And so things like that, that was sci-fi, but humor, so it's not really sci-fi. And then there were other things that were actually science fiction. And many of those felt like sort of the golden age of sci-fi, like Jules Verne, where it's coming out of very biological and natural world aspects. Those were really, really cool. We also had this far future, back to the balloons, a far future story that was kind of using balloons as a common form of travel, and looking at this world where that has advanced a lot and become really, really common. So there's balloons all over the sky and passing each other. And you think of that as a speculative future that almost mirrors how planes work now, and that was so far off for them. So he also innovated more prominently in mystery. And so we got to read through that progression and seeing the earliest versions of that from him to some later versions within the span of even just about a year and a half. He moved from something that was very proto and really different from what we would see in the mystery genre to what is an early version of what we still see as the framings of a mystery story today. And that was so interesting, really just cool to see the progression. There were also a lot of very, very dated things, especially in those mystery stories. Throughout his work, certainly, we saw a sense of the time of the person. There were aspects of him as a thinker that I think I bounced off of a lot, because he tries to be really heady and philosophical and show his knowledge very often. And that distracts from the storytelling. So he is putting in a lot of languages, a lot of references to antiquity and philosophers in the past, a lot of religious past references, a lot of references to things in other parts of the world that he presumably hasn't actually experienced himself, but has tried to gain and acquire all this knowledge, and he's showing off his acquired knowledge in his storytelling. And yeah, it detracts from the storytelling sometimes. So this was a really, really interesting buddy reading project, I think, or reading project just in general. I think if you did it by yourself to read through his complete works, it would be so fascinating. So I highly recommend doing that. If you're not interested in reading his complete works, I would say the big name stories are the big name stories for a reason. They really are some of the best of his work. I think the poems are vastly underrated because you don't really hear people talk about his poetry very much. And I'm not a huge poetry reader, and I took away so much from that experience of having read it. I would say some of that is just the research outside of the poem themselves and actually doing the work, because I don't normally do that when I'm reading poetry. And that lent to being additive more with the poetry than with the stories, because many of the short stories, like the really short unknown stories, there really is no info to find out about background-wise or what their meaning is. And so you're just reading a story and going, okay. Whereas the poems, there is a lot there present about interpreting them. Other than, I think, the big name works, one of the stories, or probably the one that I liked the most, was Bernice, which has echoes and similarities to some of his very, very prominent stories. So the duplication there, I think, is why it's not in favor as much, because it has significant overlap with his more prominent stories. But I think it was short, dark, and captured all the things that I love from a dark Poe story. And so Bernice is one that I am surprised hasn't gained more prominence. So I think that one and the balloon hoax are two of my favorites to come out of this that were sort of lesser known stories. I think that I've tried to read the complete Poe that I had before and only got like 70 pages in, and then it just sort of fell off. And so I'm so very thankful to have had my friend Shannon there to read along with me and keep me going, as well as helping this be a more enriching experience, certainly, because we were able to really discuss through these things and provide new insights to each other. So that was just wonderful. So it's both a happy and sad experience of sad that it's over, and also happy that I finished, that we completed this monumental task of reading everything Poe wrote. So that's it for my weekend reading. I should have finished my 6th Book 2 prize book, but I didn't. I, in fact, have made basically no progress since last week. I only have a little bit to finish, so that's definitely going to have to happen this weekend. And as far as other things, I've made very, very little progress on anything except for Canticle for Leibowitz, which I'm buddy reading with Melinda from my Web of Stories. And so she has kept me honest as well on buddy reading in reading short bits every day. But that's been about all my reading this week. So I, in fact, didn't finish Jane Steele, and I, in fact, didn't make any progress since last week and on Red Rising, which I need to do because I have the audiobook and want to hybrid read this time around, and it's going to go back if I don't get on it. So that's going to have to happen, I think, this week. So I think those are the books. As far as watching stuff this week, I didn't have very much time to watch. It was only in my like late night winding down, shutting off that I was watching things. And so I wound up turning to I Kissed a Boy, which is a gay Love Island. And I had seen the thumbnail before for it and just kind of discounted it, thinking it was going to be like really bad reality TV. But in every aspect, it is identical to Love Island in the vibe, the feel, the quality, layout, format, everything. Like identical, except for the casting. And I have to kind of thank Carrie from Bookish Adventures and Wellbeing, I think. I will put it down below, certainly, because Carrie mentioned it and actually mentioned the cast specifically. And so the cast is so different because they're all sweethearts. Like, so weird compared to Love Island, which is always about ramping up drama. There is drama. Like, it's a house full of gay guys and there's drama, but they de-escalate. They always are de-escalating, and they're so kind, and they have these really lovely conversations and like speak directly and considerately with each other about problems that they're having and like what they're thinking about things. And it's a masterclass in like healthy communication, I think, because absolutely a person will say something wrong or rude to another person and then they'll sit down and talk it out after. And it's just like so great. And you can see at the reunion show, I'm not going to spoil who gets together, who doesn't get together, or anything, but even after the fact, like you can tell they still are on good terms for the most part. They're still like talking to each other, and you can tell they have spent time outside of the show together and things like that as friends after this, like the variety of dudes. So yeah, it was very, very like relaxing, calming, and gentle to watch, definitely, for a dating reality show. It's still some drama there. So I think that was it for what I watched this week. And I only watched season 1 and have started season 2. So yeah, I think that's it for lifey stuff as well. I already said it was crazy hectic. I don't have a ton to talk about there because of the hecticness, which is probably good because I spent a lot of time talking there about Poe, which is fine. So hectic life. I haven't had very much time to watch BookTube. In fact, I have a couple of videos that are filmed already that I could have put up this week, but I just didn't have time to edit either of them, even though they require fairly little editing, not a significant investment, and yet I did not have time. So a couple of videos to go up hopefully next week, thankfully, without me having to film more this week. And to do with my watching, I know that people have commented. I think I've mentioned this before. I watch on my tablet, and on the app, you can't see notifications. So I actively avoid seeing notifications so that it doesn't stress me out seeing any notifications coming in. So I have not been worrying about them, but I do know people have been commenting, and I just have not had time to even get to respond to people's comments. I will do it when I have time. I try not to worry too much about that, but I do care, and I am actually ignoring you consciously because I just don't have time, not because of anything you've done wrong. So I think that is most of everything that I have to say, other than wonderful fosters. So Earl, my previous foster, I got another video of him doing well in his new home, so I'm very happy about that. I also have a new foster, Lynx, who came to me after being surrendered by his owner. So he is doing great in terms of progress, because he was really shut down and just hiding out, and slowly has been coming out of his shell and is behaving pretty normally. Like, he's a normal shy guy, so it took him like a week to start really coming out a lot. And now he's been hanging out with me while I work, like just laying on my desk next to me, being very, very friendly, and he seems curious about my cats, so he's interested in getting to know them, I think, which means he will probably do well transitioning into just being here and living here in the house normally, as free roaming and open and not having to be trapped in the foster room. So that's good news, because it does seem likely he will stay here because he was not doing well in the shelter. And after him getting out and about, I've been able to brush him a lot, and he has a lot of hair loss, which is probably from stress at the shelter. So he will probably be here, and given the type of cat he is, he's older, and he's 7 years old, which means he's probably only halfway through his life, most likely, if not less. But it's harder to adopt any cat who's an adult. So he probably will be here kind of longer term, which means I don't know how long he will be here. Since he was so stressed out in the shelter, we wouldn't want him to go back to that if he's going to be stressed out there. So we will see what his story is. Other than that, I think that's it for my week for now, or as far as I can think of. I have one recommendation to check out. Actual Spinster did a really great video talking about kind of the history of play texts a bit, and how much we trust the interpretation of people over time of play texts, like plays. And it was interesting because there's kind of some overlap with Canticle for Leibowitz, because there's a lot about people in the future interpreting texts from the past. So I'm feeling some overlap, but I kind of always feel a lot of overlap with whatever I'm reading and things I encounter through my week. So I think I will leave you with that. That'll be down in the description box if you want to go check out Actual Spinster. I love that channel. A very niche, unusual reader who reads things I don't see anybody else talking about. So definitely check that out. And that is, I think, it for my reading week. I with that, will leave you and say I hope you have a wonderful week in reading and in life. And thank you so very much for watching.